So I'm in Normandy in France, and I'm here to talk about a watch that was inspired by the incredible events that took place here in June of 1944 and in the months that followed. Now, I'm a bit of a history nerd, and particularly World War II history, and if you know the story of D-Day, or if you've watched Saving Private Ryan or the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, then I think you might enjoy this one. So if you're new to the channel, my name's Simon, and I mostly talk about watches. And today I'm in Normandy in France. I'm actually in Saint-Mère-Église in Normandy, which was the very first town to be liberated by the Allied forces on D-Day, 6th of June 1944. The Day of Days, as it's come to be known. And the watch I want to talk about today is inspired by one particular paratrooper of the US 101st Airborne, who jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought his way through France, Holland, and all the way to Germany. Like so many, he was an ordinary man who did some pretty extraordinary things. D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, still remains the biggest air and seaborne invasion the world has ever seen, and its success was pivotal to the liberation of Europe. After many months of training and preparation, on the 5th of June the men of the US Airborne Divisions, or should I say boys in some cases, as many of them were only in their late teens and early 20s, loaded up onto C-47 Dakota transport planes at airfields across southwestern England to play their part in what Eisenhower referred to in his famous pre-invasion message as the Great Crusade, a huge Allied invasion to liberate France, and ultimately Europe, from Nazi occupation. Shortly before 9 PM, more than 800 Dakotas carrying over 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions took off in formation, heading for Normandy, France. Spearheading the Allied invasion, their mission was to disrupt the German forces and prevent them from bringing reinforcements to Utah Beach, where the main seaborne landings would take place in this sector, and to secure the 4 causeways that led off the beach, which were the only means of getting tanks, troops and ammunition inland. As they flew over the Cotentin Peninsula towards the intended drop zones, 23-year-old Platoon Sergeant Tom Rice of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment of the US 101st Airborne Division crouched in the doorway of the C-47, waiting for the signal to jump. As they emerged from a large bank of cloud, anti-aircraft fire suddenly erupted all around them. Several of the planes were raked with flak, and a number of paratroopers were badly wounded before they even made it out of the door. This was portrayed really well in Band of Brothers, and it must have been terrifying to be on board one of those C-47s as they came under fire, knowing that any minute you'd be jumping right into a night sky filled with anti-aircraft and tracer fire. The Dakotas should have been travelling at 100 miles an hour, but scared of being shot down, the pilots, many of whom lacked experience, throttled up to speeds that were well over 150 miles per hour, which is dangerously fast for a parachute drop, and it would also result in the airborne forces being scattered often huge distances from others in their units, and often far from their objectives. So as the C-47 carrying Tom Rice approached the drop zone, the green light came on as the signal to jump, and Tom Rice stepped into the doorway, preparing to leap into the darkness. At that moment, the plane lurched suddenly, causing Tom to lose his footing, and his left arm hit the fuselage as he made his exit, ripping his watch from his wrist, which was never to be seen again. Now, a watch is an important piece of equipment in the military, and never more so than for the paratroopers of the US Airborne on that day of days. But for Tom Rice, his watch was also one of his prized possessions, as he explains in this interview filmed a few years ago.
When I stepped out, my left arm got caught in the lower left-hand corner of the door because I was squeezed tight, brought my shoulder blades together, and assumed the right position. So I swung out from that point, swung back in and hit the side of the aircraft, swung out again and back in again, and I turned just enough to get my arm loose. And I got a $285 Hamilton wristwatch, which was a real prize then in those days, and it got ripped off. So probably some good Frenchman found it and kept it as a souvenir. Had my name printed on it also.
So while Tom Rice's watch was lost somewhere over Normandy as he jumped into combat, almost 80 years later, the story inspired US microbrand PRAESIDUS to name this watch the A-11 Tom Rice. It bears many of the hallmarks of the original A-11, probably the most iconic field watch design, often referred to as the watch that won the war. Rather than being a specific watch, the designation A-11 refers to a specification issued by the US Department of Defense and given to 3 manufacturers, Bulova, Elgin and Waltham, who made A-11 specification watches in large numbers throughout the Second World War. While the watch Tom Rice lost over Normandy in 1944 was a Hamilton, most likely a 987S, Hamilton didn't make an A-11 specification watch until towards the end of the Second World War, and they weren't officially approved or issued to the military until the 1950s. So this PRAESIDUS A-11 Tom Rice edition is inspired by the story of Tom Rice, rather than being a reproduction of the actual watch he lost when jumping into Normandy. But with that said, there's no doubt that many of the airborne troops that went into combat on D-Day would have done so wearing A-11s. With the K-shape and dial, PRAESIDUS has stayed true to the original design of that iconic model, though importantly there are 2 significant differences, that being in the size and the movement inside this watch. Vintage A-11s of the World War II era were typically around 35mm, which is very small by modern standards. This A-11 Tom Rice is 38mm, but if you prefer larger watches, it's also available with a 42mm case. I really like the finishing on the case, which is sandblasted, except for on the top of the lugs, which have a high polished finish. It's 12.5mm thick, though much of that thickness can be attributed to the heavily domed sapphire crystal. It's available with a black or a cream dial. The dial is super legible with Arabic numerals for the hours, around which there's a minute scale, and at the outer edge of the dial there are numerals at 10-minute intervals. Just like the original A-11s, it has traditional cathedral-style hands, and both the hands and the indices are filled with lume. You'll notice there's no branding on the dial, just like the original A-11s, though the PRAESIDUS logo is engraved on the caseback, alongside the model reference and the Lost Watch of D-Day. Behind that caseback is a Seiko NH35 automatic movement, which is one that's used by lots of microbrands as it's cheap and reliable. The original A-11s were powered by manual wind movements, and an important feature of the A-11 specification was that the movement had to hack, to stop running when the crown was pulled out, so that units could synchronise their watches accurately. While I would have preferred a manual wind movement for authenticity, it's a big ask at this price point, and, at least with the NH35, the second hand sweeps along nicely, giving the impression at least of a manual wind movement. PRAESIDUS has also put some real thought into the packaging. It comes in a brown, recycled cardboard box, which has a vintage feel, and instead of a warranty card, you get this embossed World War II style dog tag, with a QR code printed on it which I presume links you to the warranty information on their website. All in all, I think for $299, or £250 if you're in the UK, you're getting a nice reissue of a pretty iconic watch. Any gripes? Well, I'd like the lume to have been applied more evenly to both the indices and the hands. You'll have to take my word for it, as I didn't capture any footage of the lume, but in the dark the numerals tend to glow quite strongly, while the hands are barely legible. I also had some issues with the supplied canvas strap. It's pretty stiff and clearly not designed for people with wrists under 7 inches, as even on the smallest sizing hole, it was still way too loose for my 6.5 inch wrist. But with a 20mm lug width, it's not hard to find straps for this watch, and I picked up a similar canvas strap on Amazon. This one also has sandblasted hardware, so it suits the watch really well. I also put it on this gorgeous Italian oil-waxed leather strap from a new strap maker that's just launched called Bourbon Ash. They're based just down the road from me in Wales, and their leather straps are insane. Definitely some of the best I've seen. I'll leave a link to their site in the description. I don't get anything and I'm not being paid to say this, but they're a brand new business, so go check them out and show them some support. So back to the story of Tom Rice and D-Day. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, using aerial reconnaissance photos, the Allied planners realised that the occupying German forces had flooded huge areas of Normandy as a defence against paratroopers or glider landings, particularly in the countryside that lies between Utah Beach and Carentan. This was a very area where the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment would be dropped, making it especially hazardous, and, weighed down by their kit and ammunition, some would drown in these flooded areas. The drop zone was just a kilometre or so north of La Barquette locks, and the 501st PIR were tasked with taking and controlling these locks to prevent any further flooding ahead of the glider landings which would take place later on D-Day. And as one of only a few crossing points of the Douve River, by capturing the locks at La Barquette, the Germans could be prevented from using it to move reinforcements north of the river and closer to Utah Beach. So as Tom Rice leapt from the C-47 and into the night, and as his parachute released and he prepared to hit the ground, the disappointment at losing his beloved watch couldn't have lasted long before his mind would have turned to finding his comrades in the darkness of the Normandy countryside, so that they could link up and prepare to embark on their objectives. So from the research I've been able to do, it appears that this field behind me is the very spot where Tom Rice landed in the early hours of the 6th of June, D-Day. And his watch is probably still in that field somewhere. And it's just such a beautiful and tranquil, peaceful place today. And it's really hard to imagine what it would have been like on D-Day, on the 6th of June 1944. The battle for La Barquette saw heavy fighting and many casualties on both sides. And while the Normandy campaign was ultimately successful and was a springboard for the liberation of Europe from Nazi rule, Normandy was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Second World War. So I'm finishing my visit to Normandy at the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach. And this is the final resting place for just over 9,400 American servicemen who gave their lives fighting in the Normandy conflict. You know, there's a guy grave just over there from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, died on the 11th of June, guy from Pennsylvania. You know, these guys, you know, they really paid the ultimate price. Really, very humbling place. Tom Rice was one of those lucky enough to return home to his family at the end of the Second World War. He certainly lived life to the full in the years after the war, and at the age of 97, he even parachuted into Normandy from a C-47 once again to commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day.